in my video yesterday, and in fact, in a few of my last videos talking about Deuteronomy 21, I've emphasized that the fact that Deuteronomy 21, 10, verses 10 to 14, it lacks any framework that clearly secures sexual consent on the part of a vulnerable party, in this case, the woman or girl, the female, who either has been kidnapped or who has witnessed her family killed and then kidnapped and taken by Israelite soldiers. The fact that it doesn't secure the importance of her consenting to sexual activity and it doesn't have any framework to understand how trauma impacts victims and thus makes it difficult, if not impossible, for them to consent. This is a significant problem with Deuteronomy 21, 10 to 14. And we have to recognize not only the moral limitations, but to put it plainly, that Deuteronomy 21, 10 to 14 places females at risk of being sexually assaulted. And if we don't appreciate that, then that will inevitably impact the way we generally think about sexual consent and potentially the way we think about it today, which places many vulnerable populations today at risk if we begin to downplay the importance of sexual consent. That was my concern. And the responses, I think, to my video from yesterday have really borne that out. So, what I want to do here is look at two different responses. The first set of responses downplay altogether the importance of sexual consent. And I'm going to look at some examples from Twitter. And then I'm going to look at a second type of response, which maybe it's missed sexual consent altogether, but which disputed generally the definition framework that I've used for sexual consent. So I want to look at both of those responses and then draw some conclusions. So we have these two responses. Let's begin with the first response, which was the "who cares about consent" response. This one, I looked at several examples on Twitter. I pulled up four of them here. First one, someone named Sword of the Spirit says, Gavin Ortland's defense is solid. Consent did not exist in ancient cultures. Families arranged the marriage and the woman had no say. Now, interestingly, I mean, I'm not disputing. I mean, that's in fact my point, that consent wasn't a significant factor and it was not well understood or appreciated in Deuteronomy 21. I agree with that. The or the difference, I think, where I diverge from Sword of the Spirit is I see that as a problem in Deuteronomy 21, that it places females at risk because it doesn't have an understanding of sexual consent or of protecting and securing consent when people have experienced trauma and their ability to consent is incapacitated, if not eradicated. Sword of the Spirit, however, I think seems to be blurring the old, as we say, the is versus the ought, and moving from they did not care to one ought not to care. I mean, that seems to be the implication that we overvalue consent today because it wasn't valued in the ancient Near Eastern world or in ancient Israel. And I think that is a critical error or mistake to make. But that mistake becomes more explicit with the next individual named Oliver, who responds to Sword of the Spirit by saying, right, the idea that consent should be the basis of our sexual morality is a relatively new one. Now, first of all, I'll just say as an aside, I didn't say consent is the basis of sexual morality, uh, but sexual consent is essential for distinguishing between acts that constitute sexual assault versus those that don't. That certainly matters. And the fact that the appreciation of the importance of sexual consent is a relatively new one in Western jurisprudence is not in and of itself a reason to be skeptical of it. I mean, you can go on down the line. The concern for animal sentience and animal well-being and protecting animals from suffering unnecessarily is a relatively new development. Doesn't mean we should be skeptical of it. The idea that human beings should not own human beings in an institution called slavery is a relatively new one. The idea that populations should be integrated and everybody should have a vote in a democratic society and people who should not be discriminated against because of the way they look or because of their gender or race. These are all relatively new developments in Western jurisprudence and ethics. It doesn't mean we should therefore be skeptical of them. And that would be a pretty radical position to take, to assume that just because something is relatively new in its recognition, that in and of itself constitutes a reason to be skeptical of it. And I think what Oliver is doing here is really undercutting the idea of moral progress by suggesting we should just be implicitly skeptical of the rejection of slavery or the integration of races or giving women the vote or being concerned about securing sexual consent. The next person goes even further. G says consent isn't what makes sexual relations moral or not. Even the cutoff we make for informed consent is arbitrary. So this person is now saying it doesn't matter whether the person consented or not. And of course, I mean, I don't have words for how harmful and dangerous this kind of attitude is. But you can see how this kind of attitude, uh, consent doesn't even matter, grows out of the fact that we begin to normalize a diminishment and devaluation of consent precisely because it was not a significant moral criterion in passages like Deuteronomy 21. This has disastrous consequences potentially for today. And then finally, this individual, Levi, says, who cares if rules of consent don't measure up to modern ideas of decorum? Marry them, send them off into the wilderness, slay them all. There's no ideal situation except those created by backseat philosophers sneering down their noses at pre-modern people. Okay, first of all, it's interesting that Levi refers to securing sexual consent as a matter of decorum, as if it's equivalent to don't burp at the dinner table. We're not talking about don't burp at the dinner table. We're talking about not sexually assaulting people. Very different things. But note, and this is why I put Levi at the end here, because he now moves from consent doesn't really matter to a sweeping statement. It doesn't matter whether you marry them or exile or engage in ethnic cleansing or engage in mass killing and genocide. There's all of these things were practiced in the ancient Near East. And who am I, as a quote, backseat philosopher, sneering down my nose at pre modern people to judge them for any of these behaviors? Not caring about consent, engaging in ethnic cleansing and mass genocidal slaughter. Who am I to judge them? This is kind of the radical termination where ancient Near Eastern ethics become normative for us today, and to question these historic standards of how people should be treated or how consent should be devalued, if not ignored altogether. This is just me engaging in what C.S. Lewis would have called chronological snobbery. I mean, this is, again, I think it just shows how corrosive these kinds of assumptions can be when we treat a passage like Deuteronomy 21 with its devaluation of consent for people who are taken captive. When we devalue that, it has these kinds of radical implications. Okay, so that's my first response to the who cares about consent crowd. More interesting were the second group who says, well, maybe there is some value in consent, but maybe my definition of consent as that which is you must be capable of offering consent, it must be actively given, and it must be given on in an ongoing way enthusiastically throughout the sexual encounter. Maybe that's unreasonable. One person on the YouTube comments actually said that me citing the Criminal Code of Canada, it was a quote unquote liberal definition, but it's not a liberal definition. These three criteria are a legal definition of what is required for sexual consent. And the absence of them means that the person who perpetuated the sexual encounter against the other individual is now legally liable for sexual assault. So these are significant issues. It's not just some woke definition. We're talking about the law here. Now, this person could say, "Yeah, well, that's the law up in liberal Canada, but not elsewhere." But let's take a look at RAINN. So RAINN is the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. They're a great resource in the United States for dealing with issues of sexual consent, sexual violence, sexual abuse, and harassment, and so on. So they're kind of a go-to standard here. And if you go to their legal role of consent page, and I've highlighted it in blue and I'll circle it in yellow, they say this: there is no single legal definition of consent. Each state in the United States sets its own definition, either in law or through court cases. In general, they say there are three main ways that states analyze consent in relation to sexual acts. First of all, affirmative consent. Did the person express overt actions or words indicating agreement for sexual acts? Second, freely given. Was the consent offered of the person's own free will without being induced by fraud, coercion, violence, or threat of violence? And third, capacity to consent. Did the individual have the capacity or legal ability to consent? Now, this rubric or framework, which RAINN says is broadly representative of the 50 states vis-a-vis consent, in a legal context is broadly mapping onto the Criminal Code of Canada. Where I think the Criminal Code of Canada maybe goes a little further than these three criterion as stated here is the emphasis upon consent being ongoing throughout the sexual encounter. So I want to conclude by saying a word about that. Why it's important to secure that consent is ongoing throughout the sexual encounter. But what I just want to emphasize here is, again, the framework that we're talking about here is not some woolly liberal or woke framework or approach to consent. We're talking here about Western jurisprudence. We're talking about the law uh, throughout North America and in many other states around the world as well, that these elements have to be present. And if they are absent, I would go further, say they should be present to secure sexual consent. Okay, let's say a word about why consent should be ongoing. Here, I'm not going to say a whole lot about this. I've already talked about this in earlier videos, but I want to point you, first of all, to what I think is a very helpful discussion from Cheryl Bradshaw. She has a TED Talk on this, which I'll link below, how consent is more than just a question and an answer. It's a very helpful 18-minute video where she gets into some of the important issues, topics such as tonic immobility and dissociation, where people in trauma situations will dissociate and maybe go into a trauma response where they withdraw, where they become immobilized in some way, like very compliant. And it's precisely for those kinds of responses in trauma situations that it is important to secure that consent is ongoing and thus enthusiastic, that the person continues to show overt signs of willingness, not just a compliance or willingness to go along, which is not sufficient, certainly in the Criminal Code of Canada. And for these reasons, because we understand now the psychology of trauma much better than we did 20, 30, 40 years ago, and that is represented in the law. And so it should be represented in our understandings of sexual consent as well. I'd also point people, if you're interested in a more high level discussion of some of these issues, to this article. I'll try to link this as well below. The impact of trauma on adult sexual assault victims. It was a report submitted to Justice Canada, going through precisely some of these issues and some of the underlying neurobiological factors that are involved in responses to trauma and why thus it is important to secure that sexual consent is ongoing. Okay, so that's my brief summary of issues. I just want to conclude by just bringing this home. About 10 years ago, there was some internecine violence in parts of West Africa, I believe northern Nigeria and some other regions in that area, where there was an encounter between a group called Boko Haram, who were like a Muslim group that would come into villages and kill some of the leaders in the villages, and they would kidnap girls for the army and then take the girls away. Many of them 15, 16, 17-year-old girls. They would take them away for the soldiers. And for a while, it trended on social media, like bring back our girls. And so people felt really, maybe great about themselves that they were contributing to social justice by, the hashtag bring back our girls. I mean, it's not a bad thing, but of course, don't overestimate the impact that your retweet has on the world. I'll say that. But the big thing that's significant here about Boko Haram and kidnapping the girls here is how much this looks like what is described in Deuteronomy 21, where you have soldiers that are removing forcibly girls, females, from their families, from their communities, killing some of the members potentially of the family and community, and forcibly removing those girls and taking them away from that family so they'll never see them again. And then what Deuteronomy 21 says is, now here's what you do to prepare these females you've just kidnapped for marriage, potentially to one of the soldiers that just took them away. Our moral clarity when it comes to Boko Haram doing that is unparalleled. We have 2020 vision. We say that is a moral crime against humanity to go into these villages, to kill these adults, and to kidnap these girls and take them for your soldiers. Now imagine if Boko Haram said, yeah, but we adopted a framework from Deuteronomy 21 where we give them 30 days to mourn their families before we trim their nails and prepare them for marriage. Would that be a significant improvement on what Boko Haram had done? course not. That'd be a moral insult. They had still kidnapped girls, perhaps young women as well, but they kidnapped numerous females, subjected them to unimaginable trauma, ripped them out of their families, destroyed their social networks, killed members of their families. And now we're supposed to be placated that they've given them 30 days before they can, what, consent freely to marry one of the soldiers from Boko Haram who stole them from their families, kidnapped them. I mean, again, our moral vision would be absolutely clear. 2020 vision, we would condemn that unequivocally. And yet, when it comes to Deuteronomy 21, I see all these Christians suddenly getting, oh, yeah, but we have to look at all these moral nuances here and look at how this text is an incremental improvement. And they gave them 30 days. And anyway, who cares about consent? Or maybe we should question your definition of consent. And I think all of this is just a moral indictment on these people, these Christians who are taking Deuteronomy 21 and allowing that to distort and corrupt the understanding of sexual consent and war crimes like kidnapping, which we would have no lack of moral clarity about in any other situation. And it's precisely for those reasons that you need to maintain your moral clarity and don't have this kind of cognitive dissonance where things that you would know is clearly wrong in any other situation, suddenly you lose track of that because you have a different worldview portrayed in Deuteronomy 21.